Hi everyone, this is Wonton and welcome to my Assassination Rogue guide for patch 7.35 and the remainder of Legion. Assassination Rogue is a melee DPS spec that relies on bleeds and poisons for much of its damage. The spec's main strengths are its strong single target DPS and exceptional cooldowns, which give you some of the best 20-second burst in the game. It has incredible survivability, probably the best defensives of any DPS spec. And unlike most melee, it's also punished less heavily for downtime. The spec does have weaknesses. It is pretty poor at target swapping or nuking adds immediately after they've spawned, and its AoE damage is also very inconsistent. However, overall, Assassination is still probably the strongest rogue spec right now, and one that is very desired in all levels of rating, including Mythic. Before I get any further, I will also mention that all of my weak auras are available in my paste bin, which is linked in the description. Click that link and you can copy this string to import everything you see there into your own weak auras. Also, I stream live on Twitch, so head over to twitch.tv/wonton_ and drop me a follow. I stream raids, Mythic Plus, leveling, and all sorts of WoW content, so come on down and say hi. First things first, let me show you a typical talent setup to get you started. Master Poisoner, Night Stalker, Vigor, Cheat Death, Thuggy, Toxic Blade, and Venom Rush. We'll talk more about some of the talents later in the guide, but for now, let's start looking at the spec in more detail. Rather than immediately diving into what each ability does, I'd like to start with a high-level overview of the spec first. Like all rogue specs, Assassination has two resources: energy and combo points. You have a base maximum of 120 energy, however with the Vigor talent we actually have 170, and then as a gnome I have another 5%, which bumps me to 178. This is part of what makes Assassination so fun to me, since such a large energy pool means we can pool for a long time. In fact, sometimes the correct way to do the rotation involves doing nothing for 3 to 4 seconds while you just wait for energy to regen. Your second resource is combo points, which we have a maximum of 5 of and are mainly spent on Rupture and Venom. The main things to always keep in mind with resources are to avoid wasting combo points and avoid capping energy. These two rules apply when you're playing any kind of rogue spec, or even Feral Druid or Windwalker. Now, being a master of poisons, Assassination has a couple of passive poisons available to it, most importantly, Deadly Poison. Once it's applied to your weapons, all your attacks have a 50% chance to apply the Deadly Poison dot. And if you're hitting a target that already has this dot, you instead have a 50% chance to do an instant tick of damage. This ability to poison your targets feeds into your most important ability, which is actually a passive called Venomous Wounds. The effect of this is that whenever one of your bleeds ticks on a poison target, this passive gives you 7 energy, but actually 10 because we took Venom Rush. Your main bleeds for this are Garrote and Rupture, and your main poison is Deadly Poison. Both of these bleeds tick at a fixed rate of once every 2 seconds, which means that every 2 seconds you'll generate 20 energy from this, or 10 energy per second. Your base regen is only about 12 energy per second, which means that Venomous Wounds almost doubles your energy regen, which makes keeping Garrote and Rupture up on a poison target the #1 priority of your rotation. These spells should have around 95 to 100% uptime on a boss fight. The other important thing to note about the spec is the Seal Fate passive, which makes combo point generating abilities that have a direct hit generate an extra combo point when they crit. Let's look at some of these combo point generators now. Your main single target generator is Mutilate, which costs 55 energy and generates 2 combo points. Mutilate hits twice, which means that if either strike is a crit, it will generate an extra combo point from Seal Fate, and if both strikes crit, it will generate 2 extra ones, for a total of 2 to 4 combo points. With our high crit chance this late into the expansion, plus the balanced blade straight, which gives you another 16% on Mutilate, 3 combo point Mutilates are actually quite common, and even 4 combo point ones. Mutilate should be used at 3 or less combo points. If you're at 3 combo points and you get a Mutilate that crits twice, yeah, you wasted 2 combo points, but unfortunately that's just kind of inevitable with this spec. Next is Garrote, which generates 1 combo point and puts a bleed on your target, but can't benefit from Seal Fate. With its 15-second cooldown and 18-second duration, you kind of just refresh this when you need to refresh the bleed, the threshold for which is less than 5.4 seconds, or 30% of 18. Obviously, use this at 4 or less combo points so that the combo point you get is not wasted. Your final basic generator is Fan of Knives, which is an AoE ability that generates 1 combo point, plus 1 combo point for each crit you get. I typically use this when there's 3 or more targets. So that's the basics of generating combo points. Now let's talk about finishers. Since you can always mutilate at 3 combo points, finishers are typically only used at 4 or 5. First up is Rupture. This is a strong bleed with a duration based on combo points spent. As I said before, keeping up Rupture on a poison target is one of your top priorities, as it gives you 10 energy each time it ticks. Like all dots, it pandemics, which means you can refresh it with about 6 to 7 seconds left without wasting any duration. If there's additional targets, you can rupture them as well, as long as you think they will live long enough for most of the rupture to tick. Although one thing to note is a sort of hidden effect of venomous wounds, which is that if a poison target dies with rupture still active, you will have energy refunded based on rupture's remaining duration. Your other main finisher is Envenom. Envenom hits pretty hard and also gives you a buff called Envenom for 2 to 6 seconds, depending on how many combo points were spent on it. While you have the Envenom buff, your poison application chance is increased by 30%, for a total of 80% with deadly poison. This buff does pandemic, however, which means you can refresh it about 1.5 seconds before it ends without wasting any duration. Keeping good uptime on the buff is important, so try to spread out your Envenoms so the duration isn't wasted. The damage of Envenom is also important though, so if you have strong damage buffs that are close to ending, it's okay to just spam Envenoms until you run out of energy. So, to recap what we've learned so far, you want to have a Garrote and Rupture, typically used at 4 to 5 combo points for efficiency, on your target at all times. Outside of which, you will mainly use Mutilate to build combo points and Envenom to spend them. Pretty simple, but it's about to get more complicated because we're going to talk about cooldown usage. Your primary cooldown is Vendetta, which applies a debuff to the target for 20 seconds that makes it take 30% increased damage from you. It's important to note that this is a debuff on the target, and there's no way to swap it once it's applied. This is part of what gives Assassination its stereotype of being a spec that just tunnels the boss, since once you've put Vendetta on a target, you're committed to hitting it for 20 seconds unless you want to lose your damage buff. With the Urge to Kill trait, this ability also generates 60 energy instantly and another 60 over 2 seconds. To not waste any energy from this, you want to use Vendetta when your energy bar is at about half. Too high and you'll waste some energy, but too low and you might be energy starved for the start of your Vendetta. Vendetta should be used basically off cooldown, as long as the energy requirement is met, and ideally at 4 to 5 combo points, so you can immediately land a big Envenom with your damage buff. Your next big cooldown is your artifact ability, Kingsbane. Like Mutilate, Kingsbane actually strikes with both weapons, and the initial hit is pretty large. This generates 1 combo point, and just like Mutilate, can generate 1 or 2 more, depending on what crits you get. It also applies a 14-second poison to your target, which starts out pretty weak, but each time you apply deadly poison to a target affected by Kingsbane, the damage of this Kingsbane dot actually increases by 15%, which means by the end, it often ramps up to do a lot of damage with its final ticks. Kingsbane should also be used basically off cooldown at 3 or less combo points, though I do hold it a little to line up with Toxic Blade or Vendetta sometimes. While Kingsbane is running, Envenom uptime is very important, since deadly poison procs increase the damage of the Kingsbane dot. In fact, ideally, you actually want to cast Kingsbane with Envenom already up, since the initial 2 hits of Kingsbane can actually proc deadly poison and increase its own damage immediately. Finally, your Sinister Circulation trait actually reduces the cooldown of Kingsbane anytime you apply a lethal poison, which is another reason good Envenom uptime is important, since it results in a shorter Kingsbane cooldown. Effectively, this usually results in a cooldown of about 35 to 40 seconds. Your third cooldown is Toxic Blade, which has a relatively short cooldown at 25 seconds, deals a good chunk of damage, generates 1 to 2 combo points, and most importantly, increases poison damage you deal to the target by 35% for 9 seconds. This includes your deadly poison, Kingsbane, and Envenom. You almost always want to use this with more than 10 seconds of Rupture left, because obviously during this 9-second window, you want to be using Envenom, not refreshing Rupture. Toxic Blade can be delayed a little if it will line up with Vendetta, with the first hit of Kingsbane, or will cover the end of Kingsbane. For reference, here's a pro tip for how I think about Toxic Blade. I generally consider a good Toxic Blade to be one where I landed 3 hard-hitting abilities, for example 2 Envenoms and some part of Kingsbane. A Toxic Blade with 4 abilities can happen and is amazing, but usually requires a little luck with crits. One with 2 probably means you're doing something wrong though. Either you're going to Toxic Blade far too energy starved, or you're not thinking about Rupture ahead of time and having to refresh it during Toxic Blade. Finally, there's one last cooldown I need to mention: Vanish. With the Night Stalker talent, your next ability after Vanishing will do 50% increased damage, and if you use this on Rupture, it will actually snapshot that buff, and buff the damage of the entire bleed. So what you'll want to do is hold Vanish until Vendetta is coming up, build 5 combo points, vanish into Rupture, and cover as much of this buffed Rupture with Vendetta as you can. For a small optimization, remember to let this buffed Rupture tick all the way to 0 instead of refreshing it early with a weaker Rupture. However, if you have the legendary shoulders, Vanish will now give you 100% crit for 5 seconds, making for a short period of insanely high burst. Not only that, but with 100% crit, all your Mutilates will generate 4 combo points, Kingsbane 3, and Toxic Blade 2. With the shoulders, which are your best in slot legendary, you want to use Vanish with Vendetta into Envenom, then Mute, Envenom, Mute, Envenom. Ideally, you want to hold Toxic Blade for this too, and use it before you vanish to buff these massive Envenom crits by another 35%. This short 5-second window is where a lot of your damage happens, so executing it properly is very important and something you will learn with practice. So, putting everything we've learned together, here's the opener you want to use without legendary shoulders. Start in Stealth, of course, then Garrote, Mutilate, Rupture, Mutilate, Vendetta plus Mutilate. At this point you will probably be at 5 combo points, but if you're at 4, just Toxic Blade. Then Vanish into a Rupture. Hit Toxic Blade, then Kingsbane, and Envenom. And at this point you can go into your normal rotation of Mutilates and Envenoms. So basically, we apply our dots, we pop Vendetta and Vanish into a 5 combo point Rupture, and then go into Toxic Blade plus Kingsbane. With shoulders, the opener is actually simpler. Garrote, Mutilate, Rupture, then Vendetta plus Toxic Blade, hit Kingsbane, and then Vanish into Envenom, Mutilate, Envenom, Mutilate, Envenom, and then your normal rotation. A few final notes on your DPS rotation before we move on to other things. Whenever you use a finisher, Surge of Toxins grants you 10% more poison damage for 5 seconds. Usually you kind of ignore this passive, but it is important to use a finisher within the last 5 seconds of Kingsbane so it benefits from this damage buff. Also, one very important trait we have is Bag of Tricks, commonly known as Poison Bomb. When you use Envenom or Rupture, this gives you a small chance to proc a Poison Bomb, which will deal huge damage over 3 seconds in a small AoE centered on your target. This proc is the reason why Assassination AoE is so inconsistent, because if Poison Bomb procs an AoE, it can deal insane damage, and if you get multiple procs back to back, your DPS will easily be in the millions. However, since this trait is pure RNG, there's not much more to say about it except be happy when it procs, and don't be too upset if it doesn't. And on a final note, overall, when playing Assassination Rogue, it's important to remember that you don't need to rush your rotation. This is not a class where you're always going to be spamming a button every global cooldown. If you want that, Red Paladin is out there for you, while Assassination requires more planning, and sometimes has periods where you do nothing for 3 to 4 seconds. Whenever you're going to use any ability, think to yourself, do I need to use this now? The answer is often no. You can wait for later, unless you've got a cooldown active and want to get the damage in before it ends. Keep your bleeds up, space out your Envenoms, and once your cooldowns are up, go ham and try to maximize your damage during those windows. Now a brief note on multi-targeting and AoE. Here's some typical scenarios and what to do in them. 3 to 5 mobs that will stay alive for at least 20 seconds, for example, a trash back in a Mythic Plus dungeon. In this case, Garrote 1, use Fan of Knives to build combo points, Rupture as many as you can, and then dump Envenoms into one target. If you want, you can pop some cooldowns on the highest health mob, but remember to be careful with this on something like Bolstering Week, because while other classes' cooldowns typically affect their AoE damage evenly, your cooldowns just kinda make one target die really fast. Next, let's say the boss spawns weak adds that you know will die pretty quickly because, Windwalkers, Demon Hunters, and Warriors exist. You can Fan of Knives off the adds, but don't even bother hitting them, that's not really your job. The best thing you can do here is use a couple finishers back to back and hope for a Poison Bomb proc. A scenario with multiple bosses. Pick a priority target that you will hit most of the time and do your single target rotation on it, but keep Rupture and Deadly Poison applied to the other targets for more damage and extra energy. Assassination is one of the only melee that can multi-dot, so take advantage of it. So that's pretty much all of the DPS rotation. However, part of what makes Rogue so strong is its defensives, so let me cover a few of those. Cloak of Shadows is your strongest defensive cooldown, which makes you completely magic immune for 5 seconds on a 1.5 minute cooldown, reduced to 117 by our artifact. This will also remove most magic debuffs, making this extremely strong, especially for its ridiculously short cooldown. This ability is what makes rogues able to go what mechanics, as you can remove annoying debuffs, immune one-shots, and often just ignore parts of the fight that you don't want to do. Keep in mind though, it can be bypassed by physical damage and certain debuffs that count as physical. Feint is a no cooldown ability that makes you take 50% reduced area damage for 5 seconds for 35 energy. In dungeons, and especially in raids, almost all the damage a DPS takes is area damage. The only exceptions to this are single targeted spells, melee attacks, and dots, and there doesn't tend to be a lot of that when you're a DPS. So if you accidentally stand in fire, or if the boss does a big raid AoE, Feint can be essential to keeping you alive. Learn to love it. Let me also mention Cheat Death here, which is one of your talents. Every 6 minutes this passive will save you from dying, although certain extremely hard-hitting one-shots will bypass it. This talent is incredible and has really spoiled me to a point where I can't really play classes that don't have one of these anymore. Aside from the part where it keeps you alive, this talent is amazing because the knowledge that you won't die to a single tiny mistake lets you play more risky, which in turn makes you deal more DPS. This is an amazing talent that I would never recommend going without. Before I give any advice on stats, allow me to point you to an excellent website named raidbots.com. This site will actually let you simulate your character to find your own stat weights, which will always be more accurate than what somebody else tells you. However, in general, your stat weights will probably be something like Mastery, then Crit, then Verse, then Haste, with Agi kind of varying. Mastery weighted gear is almost always what you want, and the second stat you want on the piece is Crit. I recommend the Pawn add-on to compare the value of gear. For legendaries, the shoulders and bracers are the strongest combination. We've already talked about the shoulders, and the bracers are very strong because they increase the damage of all your bleeds and poisons except envenom against targets that are sub 30%, which makes you sort of an execute class. Usually if you're hitting a boss and it's at, let's say, 35%, you'll actually want to delay cooldowns for a bit so that you can hit them at 30 once your bracers kick in. Other decent legendaries include the head, the feet, and either the Ravenhold ring or the Shadowblade ring, all of which are pretty good. For enchants and gems, you'll want Mastery of course, and Mark of the Trained Soldier on your neck. For trinkets, the Agility Pantheon trinket is the strongest by far. The Shadow-Singed Fang and the Seeping Scourge ring are pretty good trinkets in Antorus, and aside from that, one of the best things you can get is just a Mastery stat stick. I'll put a link in the description that lists ratings of all the trinkets at various item levels, or you can also compare any two trinkets on raidbots.com using Gear Compare. For set bonuses, your Tier 21 set from Antorus is very strong, and part of the reason Assassination pulled ahead of sub this tier. The 2 set buff just gives your Deadly Poison more crit chance after using Envenom. But actually, I don't even track this buff, because at 6 seconds, its duration is always the same or longer than Envenom, which means keeping uptime on this is synonymous with keeping good uptime on Envenom. The 4-piece gives you energy every time your Deadly Poison deals a critical strike, which has obvious synergy with 2-piece and with the legendary shoulders. With this ideal setup, the 4-piece will be responsible for something like 15% of your total energy gains, which is obviously massive. This 4-piece is worth many item levels. Get this even on LFR pieces if you have to. Finally, Artifact Relics. The 2 strongest traits by far are Master Alchemist and Master Assassin, followed by Balanced Blades and Toxic Blades, which have about half their value, and then everything else is again about half of those. Again, full relic sims are linked in the description, and the best way to compare relics is to sim them yourself. But in general, your BIS rates are worth about 25 relic item levels, so even though this 985 relic may look insane, this 965 relic with really good traits is actually probably better. Look for relics that have good traits before item level unless the difference is massive. So that's it for my Assassination Rogue Guide. If you enjoyed this guide, leave a comment with what other guides you'd like to see me make. And if you like my content, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe here on YouTube and go follow me on Twitch, where I stream WoW and various other games. Thanks for watching.